Matt, welcome back to, I think this is your fourth episode on the podcast. Pretty awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me back on. It's been a while because I think the last three that we did, it felt like every 6 months we were kind of re-entering back into that conversation. And I know that yeah, it's probably been like 18 months maybe since
Something
the
like
last
that.
one.
I did take a break from the podcast for a little bit.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
that probably has more to do with it than anything else.
Yeah. And by the way, I listened to Lee Taft on the last episode, and I heard that he'd been on three times, and I was like, I wonder if I've been on now more than Lee Taft. And I was like, that's saying something
You
because
have,
of how much.
I think Ryan Hopkins is number one. I think he's been on 5 times. I know he's on your podcast too. My favorite coach that nobody knows about.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, he's awesome, awesome. He is. I mean, very similar to Lee in my eyes, but he is someone that be a fantastic mentor. Just one of the best, most experienced guys that you can learn from. That just super, super logical in the way, like everything, the way that he explains things to me, I'm like, just makes sense.
Yep.
Like everyone else is trying to
He
complicate
he
things.
connects all the dots. Yep. He's able
Exactly.
to go here to here to here. Yep.
Yep.
All right. First thing I wanted to talk about. I saw you post this the other day, and it was in regards to like medium and deep tier plyos and when you might want to go to higher volumes of that. Because you made a post about a Chinese weightlifter who had like plateaued their squat, did 800 meters of frog leaps. A week later, or 2 weeks later, had a 10 kilogram personal best. And I remember a long time ago, so like kind of two separate points to this. Joel Smith had talked about doing like endurance bounding after a speed session, where you might do sets of like 50 meters of bounding. You're not necessarily like going all out, but you're still putting in some decent effort. And then my freshman year of college, there was a captain's practice before we even started any coaches' practices. And I didn't do 800 meters, but I'm pretty sure it was like over and back across a bunch of tennis courts. I got in probably at least 4 to 500 meters of frog leaps, and it's a source I've ever been in my life. I was sore
Yeah.
for 8 straight days, but I did feel amazing after that. So there might be something to that. So obviously you don't want to do that all the time, but
Mm.
at what point might you want to get into higher volumes of those types of things?
So my mind when I think about this stuff goes back to Eric, my mentor, speaking about what Gerard Mock used to do. And Gerard Mock is the guy that created the A's, B's, and C's of sprint drills and how they've very much become kind of disliked in the industry when it comes to everyone's like, this doesn't relate to sprinting. And Eric always goes back to how Gerard never necessarily meant for it to be for you to get better at the technical positions of sprinting. He used it as a volume and high capacity form of drilling.
Yeah.
And and he was the coach to Irina Svenska, who was probably the last female athlete to win the 400 and 800 in the Olympics, in the same Olympics.
It's crazy,
And
by the way.
yeah, insane, insane. And he had her. So we used to do this drill where we'd run. It was cold, it was wet, so we would be indoors, and we would do high knee running or A drills, fast A drills, and we would do that over 10 meters, but it would take us 10 seconds to travel along. But our legs are moving at pretty high speeds. The technical side of it had to be really stringent there as well. Like if you were falling apart, then you would be told to kind of stop, and the rest of the group might carry on. So it's almost like you're running 100 meters. And that volume work was something that Gerard had done massively with Svenska. And she used to do 200 meters of 10 seconds every 10 meters of those fast, high knee A drills,
Good God.
which is,
That,
which,
yeah. I'm
which,
I'm trying to think how long I might even last for. I'm totally falling apart. Not long.
right. Obviously, you've got to build up to being able to handle that sort of volume. Now, as a high jumper, I maybe didn't need that sort of volume, but we would build up to 30 or 40 meters. And that's 30 or 40 seconds worth of high knee. And what you notice as well is when someone does a high knee action, like the downwards velocity and contact times are really reactive, and they are almost a form of in between what I class as like my rudimentary plyometrics and kind of like sub-maximal. You're still stinging the ground with quite a bit of intensity there. But obviously you've got the fast contact. And it then kind of, for us as jumpers, when I was a high jumper in Eric's group, it bled into a few other elements where we were using things like bounding for longer distances. And it was a lot more about building just good general capacity to our lower legs and to our hips. Because you would then, all right, okay, we might do a bounding session where we would do 70 or 80 meters worth of bounding. We would do it on grass and it would be in trainers, but we would do 5 or 6 different sets of those. And all I found is that it became to us like tempo running. That's what it felt like. It was very easy sub-maximal. Once you're up and running, it's just boom, 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 boom. But it doesn't have to be this real like grotesque feeling of effort. But the lower leg capacity to be able to then handle volume in different ways in other sessions further down the road was massive. And I think that was a big part for someone like Svenska with a 400 and 800 meter event, is that things technically didn't fall apart as much. So higher volume stuff for me is about, where do I see injuries creep in a lot? Well, I see it happen at X point within a game or a sport. So it might be after the third quarter in a basketball game. Could be late in those kind of last quarters of games. And is that because of my technical capacity is failing me, and therefore I've got to go looking elsewhere to really just keep up with my like competitive mindset? So those are definitely somewhere where I would insert that. Now we did quite some volume of like frog leaping. Maybe we would have got to 60, 70 meters of that. But not quite 800 meters of it. But again, it was very much like a Gerard Mock, Charlie Francis model, in that we would do high volumes of it, but we would just do it in small segments. But we would do super high volumes of just set after set after set. And it was about quick recoveries and then straight back into building that capacity to be able to execute in pretty proficient, forms of movement. So if I'm doing like a high knee A, does my lumbar spine be the first thing to go? Do my hips drop by 2 or 3 inches so it looks like I'm sat down in it by like 10 meters of these high A's? Are my ankles failing before anything? And that reactivity goes down, and then ground contact time increases. So like we get super scared to do this dynamic work at volume, but I think everyone's pretty capable of doing that. And your proficiency is then based on, well, let's see if we can just push it just past the point where things are starting to look a little ugly. And then we can kind of say, stop, let's go back and do another set. And then the following 2 sessions, it might be that we lengthen out that time that you're working under that period of stress and see if those postural capacities stay there and if the quality of the movement remains. Now, the excessive stuff, yeah, that's sounds like folklore, doesn't it? Listening to a guy that's done 800 meters worth of leaping and then saying that he had a week of sauna or 8 days in your case.
Yeah, it is possible. It's going back to something I heard Ryan Hopkins talk about. He was with, I think it's like, I forget the person's last name, Raina, maybe
Raina Ryder.
Yeah. And he was like, one of the things I noticed watching all of these elite track athletes is they are all in fantastic shape. Like he develops a huge capacity in all of them, where their warm-ups are like 30 minutes every day. Yeah. And it is just like drill, 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 working on like postures, positions. They're moving pretty fast. And something I started doing this summer with a lot of the people I train is like, I'll have them do three switches, just boom, 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 pause a second, boom, 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 pause a second. And they're not necessarily, I'm for the purpose of the warm up, I'm overemphasizing their range of motion. So I want their knee to get actually higher than their waist every single rep and pause with their knee higher than their waist. Do that for 30 seconds. We built up to like a minute by the end of the summer. But the first time somebody does that for 30 seconds, they totally underestimate how exhausted they're going to be just from
Yeah.
doing that. And that's even adding in like pause every 3 reps. So you might get in like 12 sets of those 3 within
Yeah.
30 seconds. But it really, there is something to be said about that. And actually, over
It's
the last
compounding, right?
month, oh, go ahead. What'd you say?
I was just saying it's compounding as well. Like
Yeah.
as soon as you start to increase, so let's say that those high knees became like a sub-maximal bound, right? And you're just mopping up like sub-maximal extensive volume. And you straight away start to like, I noticed that massively I used a lot of these ideas with multi-eventers and a heptathlete that I had. She was never going to be a great 800-meter runner. And she despised going out and running 300s and 500s. So we would do more capacity work in those instances because I knew that when she got into a certain part of the race, her knees would drop significantly. And it was like she was almost like falling for the rest of the race. So it's like, and again, it could be her posture was something that she'd lost massively. So she was breathing in a much worse position. And all these sort of things really, really showed up for us. And I knew that we didn't just have to do running to build the capacities of how well we held the posture, how well we could stay in better biomechanical positions for her to achieve what she wanted to achieve. Because believe me, when you're running 800 meters and that bell goes and you go to run the second lap, if you're unfit and your hips are dropping by 2 or 3 inches, you're now
Yep.
swimming in mud because the stride length is like, feels like it's like 5 feet longer. The contacts are
Yep.
far longer. And your stride just reduces and the time you spend on the ground increases. So it's like, I think about that on more of a macro level when it comes to team sports and how that could also be, how many contacts do you see in a basketball game? There are so many. So
Yep.
if your capacity to handle those is higher, then I see some value in doing some high level volume work like that.
Something I always experiment with stuff just for myself. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to do 2 days a week. I started off doing 3 days a week of like max speed sprinting, and it was just too much. 39 now, I can't do 3 days. I had to cut it to 2 days. Started to get some Achilles issues. But the day after I would do my max speed days, I put together this like called it like a sprinter conditioning circuit. But basically, it is like 35 drills, A skips, B skips, skips for height, distance, all types of bounding variations. There's a few hamstring drills in there. And last week, I got the fastest 40 I've gotten since like 2019. So I'm like, there is definitely something to this because like my sprint program hasn't really changed that much. But I'm like, I knew I needed to do something, but it couldn't be in terms of more sprint volume. And I'm like, this is great. Like, yeah, and I feel good
That's
doing
the
it.
point. That's the point there, right? Is that you wouldn't have fit it in you wouldn't have fit in another whole speed session, right? Another whole max velocity session. The
Yep.
quality of that session would have been probably detrimental to what you're trying to achieve in the other 2 sessions. And then are the other 2 sessions affected by that third session? So you say, what else can I do that's not going to dent those 2 sessions because they need to be really high quality, but it's potentially going to feed into maximizing what's happening on those 2 days and how I execute over those 2 days. Because you're probably getting to a stage now where, let's say that you're doing some flying tens and you've got 6 reps. Now, the fifth and sixth rep, you're thinking, I could add another 2 reps to this and I'd still
Yeah.
feel good. So, like, it becomes more about that. So, your capacity to be exposed to more is open. So, hopefully, in a few months' time, do you need the third session? You could potentially play with doing a third session, maybe you don't. Maybe just those two that you're doing, you could just do more sprint volume in that. So
It is interesting. The other thing I kind of think about doing this is like people have no problem doing like high rep, and let's just say like they'll do split squat isos for a long time. Then they might do like oscillating split squat isos. But the next step for me from that would be like basically like your deep tier
yeah,
drills. It's just like one level slightly higher. And if you're doing high rep oscillating work, we're just adding in just a little bit more to that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's funny. Austin Yoakum put up something yesterday of him having athletes oscillating in a deep split stance. And I said the step up from this is just leaving the ground ever so much. Like, you know,
That's it. Yep.
you're in a split stance oscillate. I call them an oscillatory leap. So you are leaving the ground just a little bit, and it's just going to increase the velocity of the dropping action of that back hip. And like he mentioned, he's getting guys to do it for 2 minutes. You know, maybe as the intensity increases, then the pyramid kind of shortens and narrows in terms of how much volume you could do straight away. But I think after a while, you probably could build up a capacity to do that at a much higher volume. And it tends to be the way that it happens with myself. You know, with all extensive stuff, you can do much broader ranges of it, and the more intense it gets, the less that could be done. But I think that has to be the way for joint health, and that's the way that it has to really develop. It doesn't have to be like, oh, we'll start in really long positions and gradually make it super fast and dynamic. I think the real rigid dynamic stuff can be completely separated from the deeper ranges of motion. But I think I'd like to see more of the development of, let's do an ISO that's yielding. Maybe you mix it in with an ISO that is eventually more overcoming, or maybe it's the opposite side of the pyramid. Then you have the overcoming ones where you're in a deep position and you're pressing into something, and then that might become a bit more of a reactive element from a just like a dropping action.
Yeah.
That could then level up into the oscillating deep tier movements that I do, but it could be 1, 2, and then accelerate into a full takeoff. And then the other side would be the yielding versions where you're trying to do them for more longer periods of time. And it still remains that even when you get into a full landing and takeoff of like our deep tier movements. But I think you need to move up that pyramid. Too many people want to stay with the ISOs. And I think that they could still be getting like the therapeutic benefits from moving up that pyramid of going from static to oscillations to landing oscillations into a full deep tier sequence of absorbing force from a taller position into a deep position and then rebounding out of that. I think I would like to start to play with that in terms of, let's say it's a knee health issue. Let's say it is a off-season into in-season sort of basis. Can we make that more specific as we get into the season, but we still, you know, maybe we still keep in the ISOs, but that ISO volume or frequency drops and the dynamic stuff increases. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe the ISO volume increases and the dynamic stuff decreases. Depends how you want to look at your in-season versus off-season stuff. But there's a lot to play in that realm. And I think too many people stick with the ISOs for too long. Or it's just forever there. And I'm just not sure that people like it. I think that there's something else that we can give people.
I know. And I think I'm going to do that next summer. Like I'll have athletes go up to like 3 minutes with the ISOs, but once we get above like a minute and a half, I have to cue them every 5 seconds to get back in the right position because they're just they hate doing it. They
and
like
it's is it cognition sort of stuff? Is it like I'm just bored in this position and I'm just like
I think so. Like I think
what we
that's
doing?
part of it is like they 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 hate it, number one. So I gotta change that up in some way. This kind of takes me into my next question about like deep tier plyos. What sort of, I guess, range of motion do you look for? And like, let's say you have an athlete that is weaker. Do you have them kind of not go quite as deep, or would you rather them go deeper, but maybe a slightly slower turnaround versus someone? Because you could like, if you want a quicker turnaround, then you obviously have them like not go quite as low. Like, I guess what, and you can change it, but what do you kind of look for, or how do you kind of go about that?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And I think the where I'm turning to a lot more now is at what position do we struggle? Let's use a bilateral leaping pattern because it's pretty typical. It's the same as
Yep.
to how we would look at something like a back squat and people struggling with back squat depth. Now, obviously, there could be a whole host of things regarding ankle stiffness and blah blah blah, limb length, whatever. But I believe that everyone can get into a relatively good position, and so where I see someone struggle, let's say that someone can get to just above parallel and they just won't drop into that any more than that. I tend to look at that as an inhibitory response to what's happening. Is it a case that they're too weak to drop below that? And actually, when you experience some of the deep tier movements, when you are getting into deeper ranges at velocity, the damage is significant. Like the soreness, the fatigue that it just wrings you dry of energy in terms of like dropping fast into it. Your body's having to reorganize that rapid stretch at length and then get out of that hole. So I'll kind of figure out where that depth is. Now I'll slow it completely down then, and I'll say, right, you're going to get into the range that almost you pretty much can't get into at those faster full, let's say, the kind of like squat jumping actions, aren't they? And we'll go deeper into the position that you're not comfortable with, and we will oscillate there. We will oscillate in and out of that action. We'll still leave the ground a little bit. You can start without leaving the ground
Yeah.
if you want. As soon as you leave the ground, you're just going to add velocity into that bottom dipping position. So we'll put them into that inhibitory zone, I would call it, and we live there. And it's the same with injury for me. If you've got someone with a knee issue, or if you've got someone that's returning back from, yeah, let's say a knee issue is the perfect one, patella tendonitis, they've got to a stage where they've rehabbed it, where they can get into more dynamic movements. They have that inhibition where they just don't want to drop into that position because they don't want to throw the knees forward and get into that flexion. I'll put them into that position and let's see where you can mitigate pain if you've got any responses, and you can just get comfortable with what was previously uncomfortable. And I find that the more time we spend there to break down that inhibition just gives us that freedom and peace of mind from our brain, because it is, I think a lot of it is a brain response to, instead of it being a yielding action, it's now overcoming. Like I'm getting to a certain depth and I just want to overcome, and I want to overcome too early. And that's not what we want. We really want you to yield and feel free to drop into a deep position. So that's kind of how I'll attack it. We'll oscillate first, and then we'll return back to something that is a full, let's drop into as deep as you can and let's extend out of that. And you'll gradually just see that start to change. I also believe as well that when you do spend time in those oscillatory movements and you can then open some access into a bit more range of motion, general problems like ankle stiffness actually start to become improved, or hip stiffness, they just can't sit their hips deeper into something. It starts to improve because we just sit down at those deeper ranges and we oscillate and we can build high reps and volume at those depths. Everyone's depth is different to the next. And I don't think it's always the case that an athlete has to hit but has to hit your calves. It doesn't have to always be like that in like a deep squat position. But actually, if it looks relatively good, it sits below. If it can just sit below parallel and like in like a leaping bilateral pattern, then I'm usually pretty happy with that. It's when someone looks like they're overcoming that depth all the time. And if they
Yeah.
are,
I know exactly what you're talking about.
that's
Yeah.
that's a massive telltale sign. If I've got two athletes, one's fighting the force and one's yielding it, the person that's fighting the force is going to come back to me the day after and say, "What have you done to me?" Because, much like lifting a super heavy weight, if you're overcoming it and fighting that force the whole time, that fight is being lengthened. And I think when you can relax and allow that tissue to relax and work more reflexively, it tends to not do as much damage as well. So when you're doing super high volumes, like trying to do 800 meters worth of frog leaps, there's going to be there's going to be a time in that where you're going to start to fight it, and that's where you're doing the real damage. And obviously, the volume is obviously a big thing, but it's often the case that I want people to feel relaxed, and that is the most important part of the deep tier, because people also just want to send everything that they do. They're doing like
Yeah.
squat jumps for as much height as possible, and then what is the change in pattern is that your height's increasing but your depth is reducing. And I put this phrase up on Instagram the other day, in that in order for you to increase your input, you have to reduce your output. The best athletes are the ones that have done it long enough where they can now afford to increase the output and maintain that input depth. So, like I said to people all the time, do a skater bound, but try and drop your butt 2 inches lower, and it will change the movement for you. You'll be able to do about 30% less volume
Yeah.
almost instantaneously. It is on a single leg, it's pretty scary how different it is just to drop down a couple inches. So it tells me a lot.
For me, it's like there's like two telltale signs that like, all right, this might not be appropriate or they're struggling with it. What is their trunk position? And it's usually like rep to rep changes a ton. And the
Mhm.
other thing is like, what is their eye position? Their eyes start to dart all over the place. Whereas like if someone's comfortable, they're generally just like looking in the same direction. They got that like bounce out of the bottom.
Yeah,
But as soon
yeah.
as their trunk goes, then their eyes go, and then that's it. All hell breaks loose.
Well, I think with like head control and stuff, there's such a correlation. I think sometimes with if if I'm using everything that I possibly can to control what's going on down in my legs, like there's no chance that I've got control of my like upper spine and neck. Like that, forget it. Like just let it go wherever it wants to go.
Do you ever have someone, let's say someone is really comfortable getting in and out of a bottom position. Do you ever tell them to go even like wider with their feet front to back? Or is there a point where it's like, all right, that we don't need to go wider. We can make this more difficult in other ways.
Yeah, I think it does tend to be that case. There's a couple of like variations that we might play with a little bit, just to, when you're just going past those. It's like doing like a really narrow foot squat. Like, how does that change something in comparison to doing like a sumo squat? You wouldn't use them all the time in your program, but sometimes you might think, right, let's just change the stimulus just slightly. It's still a squat, but we're going to go there. So it can be an example, could be it could be like a bilateral stance where we are doing almost like feet turned out super wide, fit my butt down into it, so I'm getting massive length through the adductors, but I'm not going to do a lot of it. Where I'll change the stimulus will be in how I control my posture and how I can attenuate things with a med ball. Is normally the direction I go to. I've got a friend, Chris Speed, who decided to do like frog leaps with a 60 kg bar in like an overhead racked position, just straight overhead, and did like 7 or 8 like deep tier leaps doing that. And I was like, Chris,
I'm just
I
gonna
just
call him the king of the deep tier because he
he,
is all over it. Yeah, he
he,
crushes it.
he messaged me the other week. He was like, when do I get the crown of king of deep tier? It's what
Well,
you
I
say
just
that.
gave it to him. There you go. It's official.
He'll love that. He will
Yeah.
love that. So that's an example where I think a lot of people would never ever get close to some of the things that he's able to do. And they don't even need to bother, because they just, number one, they can't get into the positions that Chris can get into. And number two, like Chris's ability to switch a pattern of an eccentric load into a concentric load is phenomenal at length, like one of the best. And he's an international, or was an international Olympic
Yeah.
lifter. So
I think like, yeah, you want to get out of the bottom of an Olympic lift. Like that's usually the hardest part. You're
Yeah,
dropping so low once you get that such a heavy load that you better
yeah.
get used to coming out of the bottom like that.
He said that. I remember, after maybe the first year of him doing some of the stuff that I'd put out, he was like, I've never felt so like the reflex. You see them do like a double bounce at the bottom. He's like,
Yeah.
the reflex that I get out of that now, I can just bump, bump and almost like start standing up straight away. Um, and like that tells me a lot. It tells me that there's probably a lot of guys that have no idea how to work that reflexive element. So everything that they do, we go back to that conversation of me saying they just overcome everything. And the deep tier work is about creating that overload, but in a yielding, more reflexive manner. So I want to open that pocket of space for you to get into it. And I also want you to trust that there's going to be this reflexive bounce at the bottom of that range of motion that is just going to switch a little bit of that direction of momentum. But you imagine if you can't access that bottom range, then what do? It's your job now to change the direction of momentum because you've not been able to reflexively actually get that pull. So our tissues are made so much up of that reflexive tissue, and I believe that there's a lot of it at end range and there's a lot of it at top range, but in the middle, it's really difficult to judge where you're best at changing that direction. And the changes of direction and momentum of the way that your body moves is what I think does the most damage. That's why you wake up so sore after it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Um, I know you do a lot of stuff with the plyo mat. After kind of messing around with it, what are some of the things that maybe like you've learned from it, or it like reaffirmed some of your beliefs about any of the plyos that you're doing utilizing it?
Every time I go back to a plyo mat, I realize that 90% of the landings that people are doing aren't within the plyometric bandwidth of under 0.25 of a second. And if it's on
Yep.
one leg, you're almost guaranteeing it. And if you're hopping, you are guaranteeing it that it's going to be in
Yeah, it's
excess of
not
that.
happening. Yep.
Yeah. So it it's so reaffirming in that side of things to like it doesn't matter. Like if there is a flow to your movement and there is, that constant momentum and you still looking relatively dynamic and it's not like you're sat at the bottom of a hole. If you're nice and tall and you're still able to hit the ground and leave the ground, then it's still plyometric. It doesn't have to be encapsulated in this contact time, and you're still going to get the adaptations that you want. Um, the other side of it is the testing reactivity and our use of like the RSI test and the typical use of an RSI test of a 10-5 or a depth jump, and actually looking at reactivity in many different ways. So a typical RSI test is based on utilizing momentum. So whatever you've fallen from, you want to utilize it and you want to propel yourself back up. But actually, reactivity can be massively beneficial from creating momentum. So Rich showed me like a little test that he uses with his athletes where they stand just off of the plyo mat and they do like a flat horizontal, like 2 foot leap or single leg.
Yeah.
So they're going flat and then they're going vertically. And in that essence, they're creating reactivity there. And what's fascinating to see is that different types of athletes will obviously lean one way or the other. Or you might have someone that, like myself, I'm pretty equal. But on certain days, if I'm fatigued, my creation of reactivity is always still there, but my utilization of momentum or utilizing that momentum to create reactivity isn't there. So it tells me that there's that under fatigue, I don't want to take that tissue through length in a stiff dynamic way, but I can quickly shorten it to make it's going to be more concentric, but there's still going to be an eccentric loading, but that eccentric loading I can still handle under fatigue, but it's just a much shorter time in which I'm exposed to that eccentric force. So, and I don't think a lot of people were discussing that and that like how much time are you spending under that eccentric load? Because like
Yeah.
some of my RSI scores it's been impressive because utilizing momentum, I've been able to score like a 4.2, and I've been able to do the same literally the smallest little shuffle on and just boom, pop it for height. The ground contact times are rapid on those short shuffle ones onto the mat. Rich just calls them like absolute RSI tests. Is like it's
Yeah.
just like jump on and boom and create that. So that's something that Rich and I are going to build out. We're going to build out a measurement of overall reactivity for people. So, and I want there to be almost like a profile built into the app that's going to allow you to look at where your profiling is, whether you are more creation based or whether you are more utilizing momentum. And it goes back to those typings of people. Are you a concentric beast? Are you a more of an eccentric beast or elastic type of guy? And I think it's just about how you use momentum, how effective you are at doing that. But on certain days, are you different? Because that's massively something that I found is I feel when I'm fatigued, I still can produce it in creating momentum.
Yeah. I don't even know if it would uh work doing this, if it would like shoot out a ground contact time or not. But essentially, you could even do that similar start, drive off of one leg for distance, where you are independently measuring the distance you get off of one leg while looking at the ground contact. It's obviously not going to give you an RSI score, but you could kind of
You
figure
can
out like,
you
yeah.
on a plyo mat you can because you can get the split mat. So they have a split
Oh,
mat. So it's
yeah,
it's a
yeah.
full size mat, but they've cut it in half. And so you could, let's say that you set a marker, which could be the end of the mat, and you're going to jump on that mat, and then wherever you land on the next one is going to close the loop, and that closing of the loop is then going to give you the RSI score. Um, so it will take the contact time and the flight time. So you definitely could do that. And I've been thinking about playing around with that. I know that it isn't necessarily the flight time isn't necessarily perfect with regards to horizontal momentum, but it's still quite fun to get the RSI score based on
Yeah. Well,
horizontal
still, it'll at
approaches.
least give you a reliable score in terms of it's going to be the same
Yeah,
most of the
yeah,
time. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. But yeah, you can definitely do that. The split mats are awesome for that. They are so good for that.
that's very cool. I got to get me one of those.
Oh yeah.
Something else I've been thinking a lot about is I don't think enough people do horizontal to vertical or vertical to like horizontal movements. They tend to just stick with one or the other. And all right, let's say I'm just doing like continuous vertical and I'm seeing how high I can possibly get. If I do a horizontal movement into that, should I get the same exact height? Or like what I guess
Again,
is there a number to look for? Because I think like so much of sport is redirecting momentum, whatever way you want to go, and that is a good indicator as far as like what can what's your vert, and then what is it with like any sort of horizontal movement into it. And I'll say one where you have any semblance of speed at
hmm,
all, not just like I'm stepping one step and doing it.
yeah. Well, it goes back to what we just discussed. It is going back to someone that can handle. I mean, like like I do one a flat leap into high leap, I call it, or 2 foot
Yeah.
horizontal into 2 foot for vertical. Um, and it is very similar to that small leap on. Obviously, it could still be at length as well. But what I think changes is the joint angle. So when you're trying to change the direction of momentum, a lot of the time, especially if you're moving bilaterally, the tendency will be that you have to absorb more and you have to get into more of a flex position. And that's to enable your shins to drop forward so that you can control your center of mass so you don't over rotate straight away. Whereas on a
Mhm.
single leg, you can manage it because the other leg is going to be behind you and you can get your hips out in front and then you can hit it and go up. So you can be a lot stiffer. So, like in the high jump, you can run in and you can be tall and you can put your foot down and pivot over the top of it. But if you have to come in and then put 2 feet down, it's really hard to manage that to go straight upwards. So it tends to be that you're going to need a bit of a deeper joint angle. I find so like I'll call that much more of like a takeoff based movement. It's much more specific to jumps for height. Let's say you're trying to dunk a basketball. If I'm converting horizontal momentum into vertical momentum, the braking action is going to be enormous. So horizontal braking action is really makes and breaks people in sport for me. Like we discussed before, um, looking at like decelerating ability with decelerating horizontal momentum and converting that into vertical is like I think that's some of the most athletic things that you can do. So I think that there has to be a case within like a plyometrics program where you just stay away from just utilizing momentum where you're just going up and down and up and down and actually start chasing the flat into high versions because you can potentially increase the velocity into the flat to high ones more than you can do so for just going for height. You can try and
Yeah.
jump higher, but it's not going to slingshot you more and more into the ground unless you are genuinely jumping a lot higher. But I can take a lot more speed into a flat to a high one. So that to me says that I can handle potentially more or induce more force and speed into that takeoff.
Something I noticed, and I first saw this like watching a clip of Trey Young, was like he was like just like behind the 3-point line. He's virtually upright. And all of a sudden, like he drops super fast and then like plants one foot into the ground and like cuts by somebody. But I'm thinking it's essentially like a vertical movement. He's accelerating velocity down and then handling that horizontally and kind of like redirecting that. So I just think it is such a valuable thing to do each of those things. It's like way more applicable. And I don't see it besides you. I don't really see it done that
Mm,
often, to be honest.
yeah, I've been I've been just adding some like I've kind of got like a broad jumping it's kind of like a sequence of it just intensifies and it goes from like a basic static broad jump and then we end up doing like a vertical leap into like a horizontal leap for distance and you quickly understand that it's not even necessarily about the force components and handling those forces. It's the reorganization of your body and
Yeah.
knowing that in order to go horizontally, I can't just stay stiff and just pop forward. No, you've got to change where your center of mass is, and you've got to get yourself to a pivot point on your foot where you feel comfortable to then accelerate your body forward. And that for me is like a winning formula for sports where you have to drop and then accelerate. And that's in a
Yep.
lot. That's how you make a lot of plays in basketball. You watch Bobby White do it all the time with his players, right? The ball's
He has
high.
them they all are used to getting really low all the time
Yeah.
and being comfortable down there.
Yeah. From that tall position as well.
Yep.
How do I kill you off the first step? I'm stood there, stood tall, looking at the defense, reading the play that I'm about to go, and then I drop and then I've already beaten you. I've got 2 steps up on you. So that for me is organizing your body enormously well. And actually, what you see the best guys do is someone like Trey Young. I bet until the last moment before he touches the ground, he looks super relaxed, and then it's like boom, creates stiffness, and then he's off. Whereas the guys
Yep.
that don't want to do that, what do? They'll start overcoming force before they've even hit the ground. They're like, oh no, I'm not going to do this, and then they've got nothing to come out of that horizontally. So, yeah,
Yeah, like
massive skill.
there is something to be said about like too much stiffness and you're not able to rotate as well. You're not able to get as like you'll create too much stiffness before you wouldn't want you'd strike the ground before you'd want to. So you're not as
Yeah,
far out of your center of mass. You can't create as much of an angle to then get as much of a push.
yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. One other thing, I just heard this on a podcast with Mike Wadango recently, and he was talking about training when he was training at Joe DeFranco's, and he was like, I was like, I could dunk a basketball from 2 feet easily. He's like, but I don't think that type of training, just like lifting heavy, doing a lot of like squat jumps, box jumps types of things, was ideal for my elasticity. And I thought it's so interesting that a guy who like in high school had a 54-inch box jump was saying like he lost elasticity. And I think it
Mhm.
just, I'm only bringing that up to the point of like the importance of doing elastic work. And I just thought
Yeah.
like, wow, you would never guess that, right?
No, no, it's interesting to know what makes someone feel good as well. Like what it shows you how they do organize their bodies to produce force in the way that they want their body to produce it. Um, I think I was the same as well. Like the more if I stay too far as an athlete, if I stayed too far away from something that was fast, then my tendency was to creep in and be so much slower. And that straight away was a result in air time or flight time or jump height being reduced significantly. So it was like I had to keep velocity at the forefront of a lot of what I was doing. So sometimes bounding for height wasn't good for me in comparison to what bounding for distance would have done for me because I spent so much more time on the ground with the bounds for height, which everyone's like, you're a high jumper. Why wouldn't that make more sense? And I was like, well, I just wanted to spend more time in that time frame where I wanted to apply force. And then I would just do my sport specific stuff that would be the specific element of trying to jump for height. But actually, again, we go back to bounding for height is not the thing that's specific to high jump. What's specific
Yeah.
to high jump is converting horizontal momentum into vertical momentum.
Yeah,
It's
it
not
is.
converting vertical momentum into vertical momentum. That's not the sport. So it tells you a lot. Just going back to that, like that flat into a high. I'm telling you, the biggest and baddest movement that you can do plyometrically is a flat hop into a high hop.
Hmm.
It, it opens your eyes to how fast you have to put your foot into the ground and stop that momentum to then create that pivot over the top. And then once you catch it, it's like you get that over rotating feeling. It's you're like onto that right kind of sequence of movement. So
Yeah. Matt, another awesome conversation. I love these. Where can people
always.
find you? Who doesn't know about you? You're the Plyo guy, but if they don't, where can they find you?
McInnes Watson on Instagram, McInnesWatson, and Plus Plyos. They can find us on Instagram as well, or just go to our website. Yeah, and have fun with the programs and course that we got. But yeah, I always like I said to you, I say to you on every podcast that we do, it's just it's just such easy conversation. We could just I could feel like we could chat about this stuff for hours. So it's I appreciate you having me on and hope the audience enjoys us doing this for the fourth time. But yeah, so good,
Think
man.
they will. Yeah. Always something new to learn.
Always, always.
Yep.
I genuinely learn whilst we talk about this sort of stuff. So it's like it's a no-brainer for me to have this conversation. So I appreciate you, Jason.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Matt.